Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. I recently finished the knitted star quilt top behind me. And since it's made of all flannel, I learned a lot and I want to share it with you today. And I have a lot to say about it. So buckle up, Buttercup, and let's do it. My first foray into flannel was actually my second full-size quilt. And let's just say it did not go well. And I was using this fabric, which is actually a very low nap flannel. And I put it on the back of a quilt with this great idea of having a middle section with different color plaids, which I did do, and did not stabilize it in any way. So no starch, no interfacing, no nothing. And this particular flannel is especially flimsy and stretchy. And what you might imagine would happen did in fact happen, which is as I was doing the quilting, it pulled that flannel and stretched it completely out of shape. It was meant to be a square, wasn't even square. And when I turned the quilts over to check my quilting after I had done rows and rows and rows of quilting, needless to say, I was dismayed. So much so that I pulled out all the quilting, took that section out, interfaced the whole thing, and redid all the quilting. And so to say that I had a bad taste in my mouth about flannel is putting it mildly. Not that I put flannel in my mouth. Ooh, that'd be gross. So I just kind of eschewed flannel for a while. And then as I've been quilting longer and, have a lot of different kinds of shirts. And of course, I buy the shirts that I like almost irrespective of what type of fabric they are. So linen, fine. All cotton, fine. Twill, fine. Oxford, fine. Flannel. But I did buy some really fun plaid shirts with the intention of, to me, they look like Christmas, and using them in Christmas projects. And also, I need to know how to work with flannel. So I did do that. And if you saw on my sewing table video where I was working on the Christmas Advent calendar, you got a little glimpse of me working with flannel. Let me get that. So you may remember it didn't go very well with the design. Well, I redid the design and redid the whole thing and made these nifty little pockets out of flannel and stayed frustrated at every turn. Lots of swearing, which I won't do on camera. You're welcome. You may be able to see, I have not pressed this, so you may not, but I did not starch nor interface or stabilize this fabric either. You might be seeing where we're going with this, with this video about working with flannel. And because of that, as I stitch them together, and these are 2 layers, so this top layer and then the bottom, and then the background, several of these little pockets are not very square because the flannel shifted. It shifted between the 2 layers. It shifted between the 2 layers that were sewn together and the background. And I just had this I hate flannel. That was the initial lesson was, I hate flannel. And then I found a gray flannel sheet at the thrift store that looks kind of like a herringbone pattern. And I bought it because I can't be taught. And I was like, I'm going to figure out how to use this. Let me show you. So here's the gray flannel sheet. And you may be able to see, hopefully the close-up will get it. It has a herringbone look about it. And I just found that so fascinating. It's also very thick, which I felt would probably help me. And then we redid our design wall hour. Not this one behind me, but we put one up in our living room, dining room area recently, DIY quilting design wall, and used a white flannel sheet to cover it. So we had a second flannel sheet, and I'm going to be picking, gosh, y'all, I'm so sorry. And so I took the fitted sheet and cut it open and decided that I was going to make the quilt top behind me. And I said actually that in the On My Sewing Table video. And several of you, and thank you, by the way, for those of you that were like, hey, you need to be on your A game because that is not an easy pattern. And that is true. There were some people who expressed concerns over using flannel for such small piecing, and they were right to do so. Just kind of a general like, are you sure you want to use flannel? And then some advice about flannel, which I took, by the way. And so I embarked on this project, and what I have found, number one thing is flannel has its own characteristics. So if we're going to make flannel work for us, not against us, we need to understand the characteristics of flannel. So the first one is it's stretchy. It has a lot of give and relaxes, especially with the addition of steam. So that brings me to my next characteristic, which is that it likes right angles. So if you sew on the warp or weft in a square or rectangle, it behaves a little better than if you cut pieces on the bias, like a half square triangle, for example, where that diagonal can stretch and get out of shape. So those two things are very important. It's stretchy and it likes right angles. Also, it can be somewhat flimsy. Even men's shirts that you think, oh, this is such a great, soft, fuzzy, rugged shirt, can be somewhat flimsy. And so as a result, it's not very structural. Paradoxically, though, even though there are flannels that are thin and stretchy and flimsy, they can have very bulky seams, probably in part because of the fuzzy nature of flannel. So it's fuzzy and sometimes flimsy, but then as you start sewing it together and seams get pressed and then folded on one another, the seams can become very bulky. So finally, it ravels terribly. And so if it ravels bad enough that it gets down into your seam, then the seam can come apart and create holes and tears in your final quilt. And we definitely do not want that. That's kind of the nature of flannel. And so now I'm going to walk you through some things that you can do to minimize that, the impact of that nature as you're piecing. So this is not about quilting, but just piecing a quilt top with flannel, some things to consider. And we're going to start off with what you're going to do with your fabric. I alluded to this when I said you can see where we're going with this. The biggest thing that you can do to help yourself, well, or I guess I should say the biggest thing I did to help myself was I starched my fabric. Now, starch is there's a whole other video on that, actually. I make my own starch, and I wanted to show you a couple of things, but if you're not a starch fan, you can use interfacing. Now, I have in front of me Fusible Featherweight Interfacing by Pellin, and I actually, of the interfacing, I like this one a lot, but it is 100% polyester, and a lot of the interfacings are, or some combination of synthetic materials. And to me, and you may not have this opinion, and it's okay, I'm doing all of this work to make sure that I have natural fibers, 100% cotton, in my case, flannel, but 100% cotton fabrics. I like cotton batting and bamboo batting, and I use cotton backing. And so I'm doing all of these natural fibers that are good for you, generally good for the environment. And then if I put a layer of polyester behind all of my piecing, to me, I've just ruined the benefit of the fact that it kind of breathes and changes with the temperature. Now, that might be great if you want it to be really, really warm. So if you need it to hold heat, that's what polyester will do. If you use interfacing with your flannel, it will definitely make the end quilt much, much warmer. I personally would rather have something that washes out, and I would rather use 3 quilts stacked on top of each other than one quilt with polyester. But whatever you want to do. But I did want to show you my starch method because sometimes I say you want to be sure and starch it, and I think there may be some confusion about what I mean. So I make my own starch from cornstarch and cold water and then add boiling water. And again, I got that recipe from the Geeky Bobbin, and I use it a lot because I just make starch as I need it. But I wanted to show you, this is starch that I've made. I want you to see how thick it is. So that's why I have this jar. I'm going to pour this in so you can see. This is, I wouldn't say it's gelatinous, but it is very thick and gloopy. So you're probably wondering, like, what? So I make my starch in advance, and sometimes I'll add a little bit more boiling water and whisk it together to thin it down so that it will spray effectively. And then I put it in a spray bottle, and I literally douse my fabric in this starch. I'm not talking about starch that you spray and then hit it with a hot iron. And in fact, someone commented on that starch video, I ruined my iron with this starch. That's why I felt like I wanted to clarify. This is starch that you put on your fabric in advance, like the day or night before, and you douse it and get it really, like, I wouldn't say soaking, but very, very wet. And then I spread my pieces out and let them dry overnight. And they become very, very stiff as if I had put interfacing on it. And so what that does is it glues those fibers together, keeps it from raveling, and allows it to be nice and firm so I can get a good straight cut. One of the things that's challenging with that stretchy component, and it's so very soft, that when you put your pieces down to cut, a lot of times it'll slide under the ruler or it'll stretch out of shape, and you don't ever get that nice, true, straight cut line. It also makes it thicker, so if you do have one of those flimsy shirts, it gives it some body so that as you're working with it, it does what it's supposed to do. So this is how I go about that. And I have an example of that. It's going to be hard for you to tell, like, how do you show that something's stiff? But I want you to hear how you can tell. So this is the unstarched version, just like it's here. This is a piece that's been pretty heavily starched. Now, I tried to show this with linen, like a starched piece and a not starched piece, and you just can't tell. But the way you can tell is this. Can you hear that? So it makes it rough, and I always say cardboardy. It firms it up so much that it has almost like a coarse backing on it. Whereas here's the regular. This is the exact same fabric. So you can't really, there's nothing for it to be scritchy because this one is actually fairly not heavily starched. It's not as heavily starched as other pieces. So I starch my pieces and get them really good, and I mean, they're really stiff. Maybe even stiffer than they would be with interfacing. But the beauty of a good heavy starch is it washes out. So it starts off in a way that you can piece effectively with it, but then in the end quilt, it's just as soft as you can imagine because it's all washed out. That is probably my number one tip. And before we move on, if you happen to get flannel yardage or a new sheet, for example, you definitely want to wash it before you work with it because it does shrink. Flannel yardage in particular, if you buy flannel at your local big box store or your local quilt store, which I encourage you to use your local quilt store, it's just going to draw up. And so if you're using, like I do, thrifted fabrics, so shirts and sheets, and maybe you're pairing it with yardage, which I do a lot, you want to make sure that your yardage is already pre-shrunk so that one won't shrink greatly and the other one does nothing. And then now you've got misshapen pieces in your final quilt. So that's about all you can do to the fabric itself. But there are other steps along the way, and I want to share those with you now. All right, so once your fabric is ready to go, starched and thick and stiff and all the things that you need it, I would encourage you before you start, change your rotary blade. I hate changing out blades. I don't know why. I mean, I have plenty of them, but it's just kind of like, I just want to get all of the use out of it. But if you do the starch or if you interface it, it's going to be thick and it's going to put a lot of pressure on your rotary cutter and it dulls very quickly. So change your rotary blade, get a nice, clean, sharp blade, and be prepared for that blade to be wasteland when you're done with your project and be covered in lint. The other thing when cutting, and I just have my little mat and a ruler out. I mentioned this earlier because it's fuzzier on one side than the other. And especially if you have found which side is fuzzy and put your starch on the back side, the back side is going to be rough and almost slick. It's just a solid wall of glued up threads, basically. The top will be fuzzy, which is, I mean, that's the point of flannel. So it's kind of a trick, and you just may have to play with this to figure out which way you liked it. I turned my flannel fuzzy side down because I could see the threads and the grain because the starch had glued it in. And so I used that to kind of stay on grain and also just to have a sense of where I was going. So the downside of that is the fuzzy side is kind of slidey on the cutting mat. If you do it the other way, you can't see the grain as easily because the nap, the fuzzy part, the nap of the fabric obscures the grain. But then you've got that kind of hard underneath. So I'm not sure that there's one way that's better than the other, but I did discover that I have one ruler that I have attached these little silicone stickers to make it where it's won't slide and it's kind of grabby. This actually was the perfect ruler for cutting that flannel because it the silicone grabby parts kind of dug in and made it where I didn't have to put as much pressure on my ruler. For those of you that already do this, you can either put weight on your ruler to make it stay still. Somebody's recommended like a 3-pound weight, which I did not have, but I had a huge jar of quilting safety pins. So I just sat the jar on my ruler. So if you're going to be cutting a long stretch, just factor that in. But just know there's a pretty good chance it's going to shift even with it being starched. It's 1,000,000 times better than if it's not starched, but it still has that slippy, slidey feel. The next thing, and I don't even really have to show you, is pin. And we Southerners say this is a pin. Actually, this is a pencil. But we call this a pin, just like we call this a pin. Don't pin your pieces. Pin. And I actually got that advice from a viewer and patron who makes almost exclusively flannel quilts. So I emailed her way on early in the process and I was like, what's your best advice? She's like, use a lot of pins. And I found that to be true. And because the pieces in the knitted star are actually pretty small, and there are a lot of rows, there's a lot of strip sewing involved, which I'm not a great fan, as you may know, of strip sewing. Even though my cuts were nice and straight because I had a new rotary blooder. Blooder. It's a new thing. It's your cutter and your blade together. So even though I had a nice, sharp new rotary blade and had some great straight cuts on my flannel, I still pin them, and I pin them the whole length of all of my piecing every time. And at least in this quilt, and I did have some people say, I think that might be too small of pieces to do with flannel. And I said this, and I'll say it again. That may be true, but because I had committed and jumped into the deep end, I'm like, well, I'm here now, so let me just do everything that I can. And pinning for sure was one of the most effective ways to keep those pieces nice and tight together and running under my sewing machine correctly and straightly and all of those things. And I didn't have any puckering or pulling. So I think that's really some fantastic advice. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned that to you. All right. So the next accommodation that I made and that I think is helpful is changing the stitch length on your sewing machine. Mine happens to be an actual mechanical knob, which is kind of fun. It's got a little pleasant doop, 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 doop every time I turn it. I'm all about the sounds. Most of the time, I keep my piecing on 2.5. And I think that's pretty common with quilting cottons, and in my case, shirts. Sometimes I will do it on a 2, but if I'm using linen and now flannel, I really, really drop my stitch length size down. That's a mouthful. If you were wondering, I was wondering, so I looked it up, what the numbers mean. It's actually the stitch length itself. So, for example, this is, if I put it right in that groove, that would be 1.5, and that's 1.5 millimeter per stitch. So I thought that was kind of fun. I've heard people say, more than one person say in the quilting world that I have learned from, that if you have a fabric that is prone to ravel, the best thing that you can do is do a smaller stitch length. At first, that made no sense to me. How is a stitch going to prevent it from raveling? The raveling happens out here on the edge. The stitch is right here inside the seam allowance. But what that actually means is if it ravels, when it gets to the seam itself, the seam will prevent it from raveling further into your piecing. I actually did a couple of test pieces and I want to show you something kind of fun. So I have 3 pieces here. This one is, I put it on 3.5 for the stitch length. This one is 2 or 2.5. And then this one is that I didn't actually go all the way down to 1.5. I think it's probably like 1.8 maybe for this piece. And I wanted to show you what that looks like. So obviously the stitches are a little bit bigger. You may notice you don't see a very clear definition for each stitch, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the way you can really tell is when the seam is kind of pulled. And here's the thing about using flannel, especially if your quilt top has a ton of seams like this one does, there's going to be a lot of weight on it. The seams can potentially get pulled apart. And that's really the concern for something that stretches, is you don't want it to pull and then pull at the seam and both distort your piecing and then tear at the seam. I'm pulling pretty hard, and I did this with red thread so you could see. There's the seam right there, that's where the stitches are, that far apart. And I am pulling, but I'm not having to pull so hard to be able to see those red stitches of the seam. If I go to my 2.5 or 2 something, we're going to do the same thing here. I have to pull even harder, right? Makes total sense in physics because there are a lot more stitches. So there's more holding it together, which means I have to pull a lot harder to be able to see that seam. And there they are. Do you see them? The little stitches there. So here's my 1.8 millimeter piece. And do you see how hard I'm having to pull to get to those stitches? Look how close they are. They're just so close together. Now, what you do get is like I can see it just looks like a red line. I have to pull pretty hard to actually be able to see each of those individual stitches. And that's the beauty of the smaller stitch. There's just more holding it together. So if you've got something that's stretchy or that doesn't have a lot of structure, the seam itself with all those itty bitty stitches is the structure. And I wanted to show you, I did a test, of course. I'm always doing tests because I want to know. I have a deep need to know. So I did a big stitch and I did a small stitch, and then I pulled out all of the threads so that it would be completely raveled. Can you see that? That's just like raveled. And right here, it's all the way to the seam, and right here, it's all the way to the seam. Try not to look at how crooked my seam is. I thought, well, this will be a fun experiment. So I'm going to pull this apart. Okay, so you can immediately see the seam right there. Oh, look, there it goes. I was not expecting it to go that fast. So look how quickly and easily that pulled apart. Okay, now my hope is that this one will not pull quite as easily. So I'm pulling, and yes, look, oh, I'm pulling pretty good. All right, I'm pulling pretty good. And do you see that seam holding right there? Now I can, maybe. Okay, I can pull hard enough. I'm really pulling, by the way. If I didn't have a turtleneck, you would see the strain in my neck. It's just now pulling apart. And it actually, I'm having a hard time making it all the way open the seam. I'm so weak. Okay, there it goes. It finally started pulling apart. But look, it has not separated the rest of the seam. So that one, once it started going, did you see it? It was just done. Just so fast. And look, there's one of the threads is still caught in the seam. So that is what we're talking about in preventing raveling. It's raveled, but when it gets raveled all the way up to the seam with all those itty bitty seams, it took a lot to make that come apart. And that's what we want, because if it's going to get a lot of use and someone's tugging and pulling on it in the bed, like I do, then it won't come apart as easily. Okay, so that's that. There's one more machine thing you can do. I mentioned that I got a lot of advice on that previous video about working with flannel, and I'm so glad. One of the suggestions by good viewer and friend is to put a walking foot. Her comment was something like, be sure and use a walking foot. Ask me how I know. And I have to tell you, I hate using a walking foot. It's loud, it's bulky, it's kind of a pain. It's not as fun to chain piece, et cetera, et cetera. So I did not take her advice, although I knew it was good advice when she said it. And if you don't already know, what the walking foot does is it clamps down like an alligator and pulls the fabric through the feed dogs. Do you like this motion? That's great. I'm like hungry hippos here. It pulls the fabric through, the top fabric and the bottom fabric through together at a similar rate. So you don't have shifting and you don't get that kind of grabby thing. Most people use it when they're actually quilting so that it gets that middle layer of batting. What I have discovered, and if you are fortunate to have a machine that will do this, I changed the pressure on my presser foot, and thankfully it tells me which direction to go over here. Thank you, brother, for being idiot proof. The higher up in this it goes, the less pressure the presser foot is putting on the feed dogs. So what I did is every time I went to sew something, I turned this little happy knob and put it more in the pink and less in the blue, which is kind of where I sew with it standard. Now, it did not do the hungry hippo alligator pull through walking foot. That was a whole mouthful. But what it did is it lifted up that pressure foot just a little so that it wasn't pressing so hard on the two fabrics that it created bunching or gathering or anything. I did a couple of times forget to change it. And what I found was because fabric was still a little stretchy, it wanted to pull harder and ended up stretching out and misshaping the seam allowance and the pieces. So, not greatly. And again, I was using flannel for this project that had a fair amount of body. So they were thick to begin with and even made even thicker and more stable because of the starch. So if I was using a thinner flannel or a flannel that had a lot of fuzz, so if had a high nap, I would definitely advise using the amount of pressure on your presser foot if you can. If you can't and you don't mind your walking foot, that's the other thing. Put your walking foot on and then it just feeds it together really effectively. Both of those really worked. Now, downside, there's always a downside. I did have to seam reap a couple of pieces and oof, what a mess because tiny, tiny little stitches and fuzzy sides together. Yikes. I mean, it was tough to see. I couldn't just like I normally do. I had to kind of really pick it. So, what that did do was make me stay more focused and precise while I was doing my piecing. I did like one block and was like, ooh, if I can help it, I don't want to seam rip another piece of this quilt top. It was effective in keeping me from making mistakes. So, something to think about before I forget. There's one final thing that you should do for your machine. Well, before and one after. The first thing is put a new needle in your sewing machine before you start. A very sharp needle. Well, number one is always a great idea, actually, especially if you've used interfacing. So, no matter how you've stabilized your flannel, it's going to work better if you have a brand new, very sharp needle. Once you get done with your project, which I just did this yesterday, actually, when I finished that quilt top, then clean your machine. Take your bobbin out, get a little paintbrush or something, and because there will be more fuzz than you can imagine that gets down. It gets in your feed dogs, it gets in the bobbin casing, it gets all back in where that all of the action is happening. So take your little faceplate off and just kind of and get all that fuzz out. I also have canned air where you can spray. I did that without being prepared and blew lint and fuzz all over myself, my table. So maybe the paintbrush is a better idea, but whatever you have, just get in there and get that fuzz out because it will make your machine not operate as smoothly or efficiently if you don't. All right. So in our quilt piecing process, our wash, rinse, repeat, the last step is often pressing. And this is another great place where you can make flannel work for you instead of against you. So the first thing is I use a very hot iron. My flannel happened to be 100% cotton, and I would advise that you do so. I was surprised at how long I had to hold my iron, there's that Southern girl again, on the pieces because in my case, my pieces were thick and I wanted the heat to really penetrate the whole entire seamed piece. So a lot of times with quilting cottons, you can kind of just hit it a lick. I mean, like glance it a lot of times is enough. What I found was that I had to really hold my iron over the pieces for a fairly lengthy amount of time. You definitely want to press your seams open. I'm not a great fan of open seam pressing. I'm not gonna lie. Because the seams get so bulky so quickly, you definitely want to open seam your pieces. And so I've got a nice hot iron. I'm going to turn the steam off. And some people never use steam. If you're a never steam person, you're like, got it. If you're a steam everything person, maybe don't steam. And I'll tell you why. When you put your iron down on your piece, if you steam it, the fibers in the flannel absorb that moisture and it gives them that relaxing capability again. So you kind of undo what you have done with your starch if you steam it. They can get misshapen and they're like flimsier or looser, which works beautifully when you piece together your blocks in the end, or if you put your blocks together and you need to ease it, you can kind of make it have a little give with some steam if you need to, or if your block needs to be stretched out just a little bit, you can use it in that purpose. But when you're doing your first initial pieces, I would say of any kind of quilt top, I wouldn't use steam. It's just not, just dry. So you saw how long I left that on there, right? Pretty good, hot minute. And then enter the tailor's clapper. Such a great use of the tailor's clapper. I used my tailor's clapper a lot. This one was given to me by a friend. I used it like it was my life's blood, doing these blocks behind me because they were very small and I needed them to be very accurate. So when you put the tailor's clapper down on the seam, it really flattens out that seam, which becomes very important once that gets pieced together and folded back on itself. So I did a lot of pressing the back, then pressing the front and holding that for a decent amount of time. And then once I did front and back and tailor's clapper, I got a nice flat seam. So when you're looking at the quilt top behind me, it doesn't jump out that it looks really bumpy because I flattened all of those seams before I ever put the blocks together. I did finger press my blocks as well, and I did a little bit more aggressive finger pressing. I generally do, but I wanted them to be as flat as possible. Now, the downside to doing a lot of finger pressing or getting really down in the seam, like with your fingernail, is that part of what provides structure and support of the seam is having a little bit of that fabric. It's like you're not forcing it apart like I did in our example. But if you want it nice and flat, then good solid finger pressing will help you on that way. Now, I listen to music when I sew a lot, and definitely if I have a lot of pressing to do. So I found myself holding my iron on my fabric like to count of 8. So 5, 6, 7, 8, and held it down for a good long while. So if you find yourself working on flannel and it doesn't really want to do what you want it to do when you're pressing, just leave your iron on it a little bit longer. Now, my iron works beautiful for me. I typically don't scorch things. You definitely want to make sure on test fabric that it's not going to scorch. So don't get your temperature so high or hold it so long that you'll scorch your fabric. It does a surprising job of handling the heat. So that's my very best advice in all of those areas, which are a lot, of how to piece successfully with flannel. And it really all comes down to putting things in your favor so that when you go to do your piecing, you're not frustrated with the nature of your fabric and it not working with you. So we're just putting everything in our favor, making it work for us instead of against us. And I think when you do that, you'll have the sort of success that I had in piecing my knitted star quilt top. I hope this has been helpful for you today. And if you've had, like I did, a very frustrating start with flannel and have sworn it off, maybe you can reevaluate and revisit it with some tips and tricks that will make it work for you. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.